Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray, and today is episode 45, and we get into something that I've wanted to talk about for quite a while now. We talk about kind of the decentralization of the grid and what that could look like, especially from an emerging market standpoint. And we bring on David Williams, who is a senior fellow for UC Berkeley's Renewable Appropriate Energy Laboratory. And he's really worked all over the world. Very knowledgeable guy, so enjoyed this. You can check out all the stuff we talk about in the show notes at globalenergymedia.com. So without further ado, here's my conversation with David Williams from UC Berkeley. Well, David, we've wanted to talk about this discussion that's out there about the decentralization of the grid and the potential impact that could have. And so we're really excited to have you on because it seems that this is really where you can bring some knowledge to this discussion. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Okay, so let's just kind of set the parameters of the discussion for the audience. When we talk about decentralization of the grid, kind of define that for us so that the audience will understand exactly where you're coming from.
It really starts with more kind of the themes around decentralization more generally. And we've started to see this show up in different things today. We've seen it in our politics. There's more right-leaning politics around the world around decentralized governments or smaller governments. We've seen it in the news. We've seen it in currency. And I think it's inevitable, and we're starting to see the beginnings of it in energy itself. And that decentralization of energy has really been kind of catalyzed with distributed energy resources, where individuals now have control or some control over the energy that they consume and how it's generated. So to draw the parameters around a decentralized grid, for the sake of this discussion, let's draw them very big, because I think they have very different contexts, whether we're in a conflict setting in Africa or a urban center in the United States. And so I think the decentralized grid piece is built around the theme that there will be more control by the individuals who participate in that can buy and sell in that grid.
I'm glad the way you define it there. So let me ask you this, just in your opinion, is decentralization more likely to happen in a first world country like the U.S., where we see people who have access to capital and they have access to all this technology that they can go purchase, ready today? Or are you projecting maybe third world emerging markets where they don't have a lot of access to energy and they're trying to get quote unquote on the grid as we think of it? And so these new solutions will, kind of replace the grid before the grid actually ever arrive.
So I think we will see the decentralization happen in both markets simultaneously for a lot of the reasons you just described. The access to capital in the United States is built on top of an old mindset of very centralized power, very centralized governance, because it was for the common good and it was very expensive. And both of those required a decent level of governance. And so we're already seeing opportunities around that through the community choice aggregation programs, through some transactive grid, very early stage pilot programs. And then I think the real transformation will happen in these emerging contexts where there is no grid today, and the kind of shared economy and payment methods that exist in a decentralized view of the world allow for peer-to-peer trading to exist in markets where it was not reasonable before because of some of the advancements on the technology side.
Okay, and if we go to an emerging market, where would you say that you see this is adapting the fastest? So Africa, the Middle East, South America, where would you kind of say that this is where we can see the emerging market is really taking hold of this kind of destabilization mindset?
Like a lot of these transformative ways of looking at the world, it has started to manifest in lots of pockets around the world simultaneously. I think we've started to see it in Africa around things like subscription television. We've seen it around energy itself, where the concept is allowing for individuals to have an engagement with energy. And in the early days, that manifestation was around kind of pay-as-you-go technologies. We're also seeing that the decentralization themes are coming up everywhere, whether it's around cryptocurrencies or blockchain in certain energy environments. But that is starting to really manifest, I'd say, in a lot of the African contexts we've seen it, but it's really developing everywhere simultaneously.
And you bring up a good point there, because one of the things that maybe we don't think about living in America is that, okay, we kind of have this mindset of we want to get the third world or emerging market up to first world, but there's a possibility that they can pass a lot of what we have to go, we've gone through. And I think in some cases, it's possible. In some cases, not so much. They have to kind of go through the growing pains that we did as well. But in energy, with the microgrids, especially in destabilization of the grid, if you will, it seems that they can kind of surpass what we had to go through in the States as far as building out a grid and getting everybody online by doing stuff a unique way, and they're going to benefit from that. That's kind of how I see it playing out potentially. Now, for large urban areas, obviously I think that's a different discussion, but for these rural areas in Africa where there's vast amounts of population who doesn't have power, we can get them up to the present day, quote unquote, pretty quickly, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you. I really appreciate, this leapfrog idea that, especially as we saw like the end of phone poverty in Africa, we will see the end of energy poverty in Africa. But when we started this journey and I started working in renewables in Africa in the early 2000s, there was the presumption of what you just laid out, that we would find the pathways that allowed that acceleration to happen quicker and have energy in the hands of people, but that it would have to go along a similar pathway, and that we may be able to jump over some of the fossil fuel pieces, but the reality is we were going to go along that same extractive path with large centralized generation, or it was going to be very small localized generation. Where I think things are headed today is we're going to see a very quick transformation because of kind of the microgrid technologies that you described will allow for individuals that participate on that microgrid to individually contribute and individually take the benefits. And that technology wasn't robust enough in the early days, but we're seeing in different markets around the world that there is a lot of very established players that are starting to lean more and more on these peer-to-peer trading algorithms.
Yeah, and it seems that one of the things that I've noticed, obviously from doing the show and just from business in general, is there's a lot of entrepreneurial aspirations in the renewable sector, which is going to help it because I'm a free market guy and I want competition because competition gets people power faster because people are trying to compete for clean or quick ways to do this that are clean and they're effective. And so I think that we're seeing that this decentralized thinking, especially with microgrids, as we talked about, it seems to have a lot of interest from entrepreneurs here in the States and abroad.
I think that the opportunities here are enormous because for entrepreneurs, there have been a lot of barriers in the traditional ways that energy has been centralized. And those barriers, many for good reason, but have been set up for centralized control and centralized oversight of those energy markets, not allowing for new participants or new engagement of those participants. And I think there are positives and negatives to that. This does create a marketplace where individuals can perform in a large marketplace that's traditionally been held out for only the large players, but it also allows small developers to participate who may not have the experience that the former markets that were very much more staggered and really only worked for the large players to now participate. So I think that we will see a large entrepreneurship role in emerging markets and in the US, but really driven in these emerging markets that allow energy access to happen much quicker.
Okay, and I got a question for you. Let's shift gears. One of the things that I've kind of thrown out there before, at least privately, is a concern for how will renewables especially work. We know, being my background is obviously more oil and gas than it is renewables. And so if you have a pipeline that gets struck and it blows up, and we know the repair times for that. What about these areas, especially in Africa, where you see there's conflict or there's war going on? How will renewables, especially these microgrids, are they profitable? Are they viable? Can they be replaced quick enough in those type of environments? Or is it going to be something that may hinder the development for people who don't have access to power because the repair time or the replacement time in these kind of conflict areas is maybe too much for them to risk?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there's two benefits to a heavily decentralized grid. So today we're starting to see these crystals in different, maybe more urban centers around what we had been calling microgrids. But I think that there's two answers to that question. Today, now, those seeds that happen to be in conflict settings or in difficult places do have high costs of energy and therefore very high costs of return that would be required to build those distributed energy resources. So today, there's an economic reason for those systems to come back online. And if that's sufficient, then we'll see that the response times reflect that. What I see for the future is that these seeds will ultimately be interconnected, and then therefore the benefit of a distributed system is that no one system is controlling everything. Whereas today, in a lot of these emerging markets, the whole country or specific regions are really run by one or two very large power plants that one upset there really takes everyone into the dark. And so I think we'll find is the response times in general will fall dramatically because you will be able to buy and sell kind of on a more distributed basis.
Okay. Well, I guess kind of a follow up in a different vein with what that would be is what do you think about these areas where they have an established grid and renewables come in and people start coming off the grid, and then the cost is going to be raised for the people that surround them because I'm on the grid, but my three neighbors, they get off the grid and all of a sudden my cost goes up. How will we navigate that stream, do you think?
This is a real problem, and I think a challenge when we have a fracture in the way people think. And on one end of that extreme is what we saw similarly in the telephone markets, where that infrastructure did suffer the consequence of having everybody move into a new marketplace that was no longer requiring use of that infrastructure. And so there can be losers, I think, in the scenario you just described. The real challenge that we have as an industry is that if we're not all able to transition, and today the answer has been we are not all able to transition because renewables and the technology and the capital investments are so large that the scenario you just described isn't universally applied. It will take the higher creditworthy, higher capable clients off the grid first because they're the ones that can participate and see the economic benefits, both in the capital and the technology. So, yeah, I think that, the answer is unclear to me. I think we will see that challenge, that the operating the grid will become an expense that has to be passed through. What I'm hopeful for is that transition period will go quickly and that there will be distributed energy resources across the grid that the grid operator can rely on to bring down the overall cost of operating the grid. And that ultimately, I think we'll find the same with the seed idea in Africa, that these small grids will become interconnected. And so the grid operator still has a real role to play that has sizable returns associated with it, but there could be a transition period where there is a smaller population to divide those costs across.
Yeah, and I definitely do not propose to have an answer. It's a discussion that I think we should have. I guess my fear is, on some level, we get people who haven't had power. Power, that's a good thing. And then we get people who have power, a different way to get power. They come off the grid, and then you put more people without power. And I guess the fear, from my standpoint, I'm looking at it, is going, especially like Africa, where you have a lot of corrupt governments, is I would be fearful to say the government gets more control in those areas because they're trying to stabilize themselves. So it's just a fascinating dynamic to look at and go, I'm not sure how we're going to navigate this stream, but I want to make sure that conversation's out there because we as people in the energy business want to make sure we're doing the right thing. And that's just kind of my take on it.
Well, I think that I agree with you. There are challenges, particularly in these peri-urban environments where the grid is overhead and the people that live in that community don't have access to it because they can't afford the connection charge. But in some of those contexts, it doesn't make sense for them to connect to the grid as the cost of renewable installs has fallen so dramatically. In terms of looking at markets where there are either corruption or complexity, I think the distributed mindset allows it to be much easier managed. In many markets, the utility has a lot of control in their ability to see that things happen because they are the single provider. And so in a heavily distributed marketplace, I think we'll find that competition will lead to lower costs of energy for everyone. And we'll find a more stable, stronger grid because the grid operator will continue to exist by connecting these systems and no longer having to build one large power plant somewhere that has long distribution and transmission miles to cover.
Okay, so I want to ask a question in two parts. So the next 5 years or 10 years, whatever time frame you want to look at it, what are the obstacles that we're going to face as we bring power to these people who don't have power? Maybe they have a little bit of power, but not enough. So what are the obstacles that are in the way today? And then B, what opportunities is that going to create for people in the marketplace who want to solve these problems?
Absolutely. So I think even the words you just used are a really important part of this discussion, that the distinction between power and energy is one that's not well understood in these markets. And we've looked at it for too long about how much energy is available locally, and that energy being a currency that could buy clean water or television or internet service. What I think we're finding is that to make those parts of the world places of economic inclusivity really requires power. And that power to look for commercial loads and tap into the markets where we have had competition on appliances that can work in low load environments, but ones that are can be power consuming. So I think the opportunity that kind of lays out is that we will see, and I think you're right, that whether it's 5 years or 10 years, we will see energy access change forms quite dramatically. And I do believe that we will see the end of energy poverty in our lifetime, similar to how we saw the end of phone poverty. However, I'm not for sure we will see the end of power poverty in our lifetime, that those heavy economic centers where we're going to be able to provide the jobs and be able to be competitive will require low cost available energy or available power for decades to come. And that is a much slower marketplace where solar and some of the other renewables may not be able to solve all of the needs immediately, even though the power prices are dropping or the equipment prices are dropping dramatically. So I think that day's coming, and heavily distributed energy resources are the way to do it, but it will be a combination of renewables and battery technologies and maybe some of the more traditional energy technologies as well.
Okay, so last question before we let you get out of here. Listeners, we have listeners across the world, all age groups. What would you say if someone who's maybe looking to get into this space, they're looking to get in here, they don't have a background in renewables or microgrids or any of that kind of stuff, and they're saying, but you know what, this is really fascinating. I want to work internationally. I want to work in all these different spots. I want to bring viable solutions to these people who don't have access to power. Where would you say is a good starting spot, and what kind of career paths are, in your opinion, the most viable over the next decade or so?
Sure. And I think that, there are different contexts of this. And one of the things that we didn't touch on, but I think is really important is, so I work on the program of conflict, climate change, and green development at University of California in Berkeley. And so I think there are opportunities now that there are so many displaced persons around the world that we will find that energy is one of those barriers in these communities to get them restabilized on maybe a longer trajectory than we have had in the past, because we're entering a very different dynamic in the world today. I think using that as an example, the opportunities for people today that want to participate in this is that they exist in most of the lines of business that are already available in these places. So people that are working in the humanitarian setting, people that are working on economic inclusivity or just manufacturing, that it's not necessarily just an energy play, because the energy itself will be a currency that's able to really buy those things that are important in these specific communities. And now that we're looking at it with this very decentralized lens and a very low cost of equipment, I think we've entered a new place where every industry will now have to think about energy and energy density of the work that they do. Specifically around energy, there are many programs that do this. The University of California has some that are very focused on energy resources and their application in these markets where there are lack of resources or where distributed energy is not yet a thing. And then I would also encourage people that are interested into it to look at ways to bridge the existing economics with renewables. And, opportunities around that are things like subscription television service or things like internet connectivity that may not exist today. And I always put it to that Henry Ford adage that if he'd asked his customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. That we may find that there are lots of ways to bridge into these markets that's not specifically related to just energy generation and kind of the more traditional independent power producer model and individual consumers.
Well, I love the way you answer the question, because you kind of think about it like I do. And, I've told people before that the price of oil, goes to $100 a barrel, let's say, overnight, and it stays there for a long period of time. Well, obviously, there's a lot of oil and gas jobs that are created, but there's a lot of other jobs that really don't directly have anything to do with oil and gas. But you have people who, truck driving jobs and equipment jobs and all this other stuff that you wouldn't necessarily think as a quote unquote oil and gas job that are affected. And that's the same as anything that we look at in the energy business. And as you mentioned, it goes so wide, it touches everything that we do, that really there's a lot of opportunities, even if you wanted to look at it from a quote unquote non-energy perspective. So I enjoy the way you think about it, because I like to think about that same way as well. Thank you for your time today. We really appreciate it. Is there anything that you want to plug or promote before we let you go?
Well, yeah, and the thing I think is interesting, and to build on a little bit of what we were talking about around conflict, is we'd love to have people help participate in creating market mechanisms that allow these energy projects to happen. And one of those ideas that at UC Berkeley that we've been working on is the idea of creating a new renewable energy credit called a Peace Renewable Energy Credit. And the real thesis here is, could we look at the refugee setting and apply these market mechanisms where energy prices are very high, the consequence of not having energy also is very high, but a presumption that these refugee camps someday will go back into a more traditional living arrangement. And so we'd love to have anyone that's interested be able to participate in that. And you can find that website online and really kind of dig in a little bit around those market mechanisms that allow renewable energy to exist in these complicated places.
Okay, great. And we will link to that and everything else where you can find David Williams and all that there is to find out about him. And there's a lot, trust me. If you go read his bio, which will be in the show notes at globalenergymedia.com, you can find all of his information, how to participate in this program, and everything else that he has going on. David, thank you so much for coming on. Really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you so much.
David, thanks again for coming on. Really enjoyed the discussion, and I look forward to having you on again. You can check out all of David's information at globalenergymedia.com in the show notes for episode 45. Almost episode 50, and we're hoping to get on the man, the myth, the legend, the godfather of oil and gas podcast, Mark LaCour, for episode 50. If you missed it, he was our first ever guest on episode 1, and so hoping to bring him back around for episode 50. The Global Energy Leaders podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders podcast, powered by R Squared Global.